Right. Hi, Caleb.
Hi.
It's good to see you again.
Sure. Good to see you as well.
Yes. All right. So, I think first off, with this conversation today, we're going to be discussing this book, Letter to Bob Avakian, which is what number is this in the number of books you have written so far?
I don't know. I haven't counted,
You were
actually.
quite prolific. So yeah, I'm like, ugh. I was like, I thought about looking it up earlier. I was like, would I even get an accurate idea of that?
There's a lot of
So
like pamphlets in there that are, do they count or
yeah.
not? Or.
And then I remember you used to write articles too, and you had a blog way back in the day that was really good.
Oh,
So
thank you.
yeah. Okay. So first off, I liked this book. And I thought it was interesting that it was written as a letter. So, what I wanted to ask you is are you hoping with this being a letter and the style of it being written in a letter that maybe this would open up communication with the RCP about these issues? Or was it just meant to be kind of more educational for the public? Because we see these, open letters published a lot of the time, but this is a very in depth thick letter. It's around a lot of different issues. So, what was your intention with writing the book?
Well, I did towards the end say that I would like to see them respond to this and I would like to open up conversation. However, I don't expect that. My expectation is that they will view this as some kind of government conspiracy against them or some kind of attack on their organization. And in light of everything they've been through, especially over the last couple years, I would expect they probably won't take a time to reply. But if they would, I would welcome that. It was written. This was not a vicious attack, and this was not a heated polemic. This was an attempt to sum up their achievements as well as criticize their political line and their outlook. And I spent a lot of time praising them for their accomplishments in the book. If I were simply trying to trash them, I would have written it very, very differently. And in fact, I was inspired to write it because I saw a lot of very unfair attacks on Sansara Taylor and Bob Avakian in mainstream media last summer. And I thought that it was important to speak in their defense as much as I disagree with them and then talk to them about the things that I do disagree with them about. I think I was mainly trying to talk to the people who would be interested in their organization, because they do a lot to promote Bob Avakian's work and writings. And so I want to be part of that conversation too. And I would like people that are looking into Bob Avakian to also look at what I have to say and see where I differ, but see how I also assess their achievements. That was kind of the idea.
Yeah, I was not really aware that they had been canceled, as you put it, last year. I don't know if my audience would be aware of this. I have had people over the years write to me about the RCP asking for my input. And honestly, I just haven't really interacted with them. They weren't very, I mean, maybe they're around here, but I haven't met any members other than I did meet Sansara Taylor years ago at a conference. But apart from that, they've been kind of just not part of my community. So I haven't interacted with them much, but they do seem to be very active on campuses and also around various social justice issues. So they do seem to be a lot of people's, I guess, entry point into meeting a communist organization. So I do think it is important that, and honestly, this book is a good resource for people to understand kind of what they're about and their history, and also, some of the differences that other communists might take with them as well. So I appreciate actually that it's been published, because for me, I just haven't really had much information to give people when they write to me about them.
Yeah, well, last summer, the Roe versus Wade decision by the Supreme Court was overturned, and the RCP, to their credit, I mean, they are very skilled organizers, and Bob is, the leader of the RCP, Bob Avakian, but he's 82 years old. But kind of the up and coming leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party is a woman named Samsara Taylor. And you mentioned that you met her at a conference years ago, and that she is very much a feminist. I believe she still, or at least one point, ran stoppatriarchy.org, the website. I don't know if that's still up. Is that still up?
Yes, I don't know. I should have looked it up, actually. I was curious about it recently, but when I met her, that's what they were involved in, because I was doing the anti-porn work with Stop Porn Culture at the time, and there was a big conference held in Boston. So I went and I met her there, and she was promoting Stop Patriarchy, and they gave out a bunch of, like, I don't know, stickers and little cards, like, to put up in different places with, these very radical, slogans. And they seem to be doing that with, I noticed when I kind of looked into it deeper, that they kind of do this with other issues. Like, they kind of create a group, in maybe a united front kind of way, but it does seem that they're kind of in control of it. And so I thought that was kind of interesting how they organize that way. But I do notice that people kind of come across them because they're working on other social justice issues. So yeah, the abortion thing was pretty big, and Stop Patriarchy. I mean, it's very clear language to use, and it's language that many people are uncomfortable with in times. So it is pretty interesting that they would use that language specifically. So it does denote a kind of feminism.
Yeah, and Sincera and her organization, they started something called Rise Up for Abortion Rights, and they got right out in front of protesting for abortion rights in the aftermath of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And they were on MSNBC, and AOC made kind of a surprise appearance at one of their rallies in New York City. And it seemed like if that was the issue that one is committed to organizing around, which for me, that's not, but if it was, you would think they were doing exactly the right thing. And so then the response in the following couple weeks was very nasty hit pieces on them that were published in Vice magazine, on the Daily Beast, on The Intercept. All these publications started talking about how the RCP is this communist cult that is what is it? They're co-opting social justice movements, and Bob Avakian and Sincera Taylor just got destroyed. And I believe Planned Parenthood and a number of other Democratic Party pro-choice organizations published a letter saying that they are not welcome at any of their conferences. And it was just horrible what was done to them. And I'm sitting there as someone who doesn't agree with them. And I think that some of the protests they did in churches were very inappropriate, honestly. I don't think it's appropriate to ever disrupt a person's place of worship, regardless of their views. But at the same time, they just didn't deserve to be smeared this way. They're not a cult, and they're not, co-opting social justice movements. They've been doing this since before you or I were born. Right. So, I just felt a need to on the one hand defend them from the smears and kind of call out the cancel culture atmosphere that exists on the left and that has kind of become part of the wokeness, but at the same time also criticize their views about communism, because I think their views about communism are a bit misguided and they're out of step with the global communist movement. So that's why I decided to write the book.
Okay. I just had a thought while you were naming off these publications that attack them. Vice. What is a vice? It's not a good thing, is it? What is it to intercept? It doesn't sound good. No. What was the other one? The Daily Beast. Who is the beast? Satan. Okay. These people, there's a lot of information you can glean just from what things are called. And yeah, I would just.
Wow, that's a good point. Actually, I never thought of that. Vice, Intercept, and the Beast.
Yeah, these aren't this. Yeah, there's an agenda, and it's they make it clear what they're about. There's something about how I would say evil has to operate with your consent. And they do it through these sleight of hands. So we don't always see it. There's also like this social media app that I refuse to use. It's called Discord.
Yes. And it
Right.
creates
That
discord.
language there.
I refuse to use it. Actually,
Right.
every time I've ever had an experience with it, it results in creating a huge amount of discord.
Right.
And so I've just said to people, I have nothing to do with it. And people continue making Caleb Maupin discords, and I always tell people that's not me. I don't know who made it. That's not me. And then they disappear pretty quickly. But yeah, there you go.
I think it's important to look at what things are called. You know, what something is titled does say a lot about what their agenda is. So that's not the point of this conversation, but it did come to mind, and I want to put that out there for people listening. You know, if it's called Vice, you probably shouldn't be reading it. You know, our vices are something that we need to master. Okay, I'm getting off topic.
No, I never would have thought of that. Actually, I think it's a brilliant observation.
You know, think about it, people. Like, you know, there's a war on for our minds and our souls, and we do have to like be vigilant and be mindful that oftentimes these, especially like these, I don't even know how to put them, these fake liberal rags, and just so much of it, it's so clear. They make it very clear that they're operating with this evil agenda, and you just have to have eyes to see it, and, you know, keep yourself aware. Like, what is this called? Do you not know what this word is? Maybe look it up, maybe think a little bit deeper, because the agenda is often evil. Anyway. Sure. Getting into that. Okay. So yeah, I wanted to talk about that. So I did not know about this cancellation. I do try to, you know, stay out of that, and obviously they aren't as active here in Portland on the West Coast as they are in other parts of the country. But I just from my awareness of them, they are, regardless of what you could say about this organization, disagreements you could have, they are genuine in their intentions. And it's very disgusting when people who are genuine are smeared in this way. And it's very clear too, like, that organizations like Planned Parenthood, I don't know who else you mentioned that had like written a statement against them, but these organizations don't want help. They thrive under the chaotic conditions. The more people are afraid that we're going to lose the rights, you know, the more likely they are to give money to these organizations. So a lot of their tactic has been the fear angle. Like, they operate through fear. So if you have like a militant movement that's actually standing up for something like abortion rights, it's not going to go well with the agenda of something that is in effect a business, and a business that operates through fear and gets most of its funding through fear. So that's too bad. And I do hate to see that. I do hate to see when people who are genuine are attacked that way. So let's move on a bit here. So one thing that I really appreciated in this book was that there was discussion around imperialism, you know, what it actually is, and the fact that Russia and China are not imperialist countries. Because I do see this very often with many people who are leftist or even not, but they seem to think that there's some equivalence between American, British, you even brought up French imperialism in this book, which I appreciated, comparing countries like Russia and China. It's there's no comparison. So I guess one thing that I didn't really understand, and maybe I thought you could give insight about, is why do communists like this, like, why do they think of Russia or China as imperialist nations? Do you have any insight about that?
I think it's because they don't know what imperialism is. I mean, there's an actual scientific, economic definition of imperialism.
I'm going to read it out loud. But
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's see. I think that's what and I'm so grateful for this because you brought it back to Marx and Lenin, okay, and specifically Lenin. And can I just say that, like, I don't know, people are not reading Lenin. If you want to understand, you got to read Lenin. And I just, it's been years since I've, read any Lenin, but he was always like my favorite writer of any of the communists because it was just like I got so engrossed and I was learning so much so quickly. And there was just, so I appreciated quoting him about this. So let's see. I'm trying to see where I wanted to start. So yeah, this is on page 114. What section is this? It says imperialism is a system. So you wrote, for Marxist-Leninists, imperialism is not a verb, it is a noun. It is not something you do. It is not a policy or an action a government takes. Imperialism is a global economic system. Your organization, and you've written this as a letter, so I appreciate that. Your organization seems to understand this on some level, frequently referring to the US system as capitalism, imperialism in various publications. And then you go on into Lenin. Lenin offered this definition when laying out his new concept of imperialism as capitalism in its monopolistic stage. He wrote, "We have to begin with as precise and full a definition of imperialism as possible. Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is monopoly. Oh no, monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism." So, he continues, monopoly manifests itself in 5 principal forms: cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree which gives rise to these monopolistic associations of capitalists. The monopolistic position of the big banks, 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economic life of America, France, and Germany. And then 3, seizure of the sources of raw material by the trusts and financial oligarchy. Finance capital is monopoly, industrial capital merged with bank capital. And then 4, the economic partition of the world by international cartels has begun. There are already over 100 such international cartels, which command the entire world market and divide it amicably, quote unquote, among themselves until war redivides it. And then 5, I'm just going to skip through it. 5, the territorial partition of the world. So as in colonies. So Russia doesn't have any colonies. China doesn't have any colonies. They don't behave this way. This is the behavior of the West specifically, and, America, where, we are privileged to be citizens. So for me, it's just devastating to me, like with the war in Ukraine, that has been such a big deal. When it first, let's just say when Russia first invaded Ukraine, there was a lot of furor, and it was surprising to me how many, people I know were, posting Ukrainian flags and, being very, just posting all this information. I'm like, you don't know anything about this.
Yeah, well, now we're seeing the fallout
that has been going on for years, for one.
We're starting to see the fallout now of that Nazi in the Ukrainian parliament, like an actual Nazi who fought against the Soviet Union in World War II, got a standing ovation in the Canadian parliament. Did you see that one?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of Canadians that I know have been like really embarrassed about it. I mean, they've been embarrassed for years, but now it's like, oh man, this government is unhinged. But yeah, it's not just that. I felt like, when I would try to engage with the few people that I did, because I'm not one to try to convince people that I know are lost anyway, but with the people I thought would be more receptive, um, around the fact that I felt Russia was justified in invading the Ukraine. And, I didn't, obviously, it's a terrible thing that it happened. Obviously, any invasion is terrifying for the people that live there. And I know it's complicated in that regard from a human angle, but it was understandable why it happened. But a lot of people threw back this Russian imperialism kind of language. And it just kind of is amazing to me that that is kind of accepted by people, or that people are uncritically doing that. And I think a lot of it just has to do with they don't really understand, like you've stated, what imperialism is. And obviously Lenin gives us in, what's the name of his work? I think it's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism.
Yep.
He gives us in that, an understanding of what it is. And I haven't seen anybody else, explain it better. So
yeah,
like I said, I appreciate you kind of going to Lenin in here and using Lenin to kind of break apart the wrong, how do I put this about them? I feel very wrong analysis that is being put forward by anyone who would use that language.
Yeah, well, I've been to Crimea and I've met the people of Crimea. This was, back in 2017, 2018. And the people in Crimea, I mean, Crimea is a very small peninsula, but the people there, they speak Russian. Most of them were associated with the Russian military base that is there. And that territory was considered to be part of Russia until the death of Stalin. And after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev signed it over to Ukraine as some kind of backroom deal, but they were all the Soviet Union, so it didn't really matter anyway. They were all just the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union fell, there was a treaty that was signed that said Ukraine got Crimea, but Russia got to have their big, huge military base there. And so that was the understanding. But then in 2014, the United States overthrew the Ukrainian government and installed a fanatically anti-Russian government, at which point, whether or not that military base could remain was up in question. And almost everyone in the Crimean Peninsula is economically tied in to that Russian military base or is doing business with Russian companies or something. So for them, if that Russian military base got kicked out of there, they would all lose their jobs and their livelihoods. And so they just had a referendum and they voted for independence. And you'll notice there's no images of like Russian tanks rolling over the border in Crimea because they were already there. I mean, the Russian military base was already there. Everyone there was already like Russian, doing business with Russia, tied to the military base. And I also, though, have met with young people who fled from Donetsk and Lugansk, the regions of Ukraine that, that voted to join with Russia recently, or where the fighting is currently going on. People don't talk about the fact that since 2014, Russia has absorbed 2 to 3 million refugees from these areas. 2 to 3 million people have fled. And the Ukrainian government has been bombing those areas relentlessly since 2014. They killed at least 14,000 people. Some estimates are maybe as many as 17 or 18,000 people. And they continued bombing them. There was a peace treaty that was signed called the Minsk Accords that was supposed to require Ukraine to then let them reintegrate back into Ukrainian society and maintain their language and their regional autonomy. And the Ukrainian government disregarded the Minsk agreement. Zelensky, who's currently president of Ukraine, got elected, and his platform was that he was going to make peace. He was going to implement the Minsk agreement, and the Ukrainian people voted for him because they thought he would make peace. And then he got into office and discovered that he's not really in charge. The United States and Britain are really in charge. And it's led to this situation where I don't know if you remember in the lead up to the ultimate, event, the ultimate beginning of the, the so-called invasion, if you want to call that, or the intervention, where the USA was basically daring Russia to do it. The USA was announcing to the whole world, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And Russia's like, no, we're not. No, we're not. And they were announcing to the world, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And then they then launched an all-out offensive into these territories. They were just going to kill everybody there, and bombs started going off and all of that. And at that moment, Russia said, okay, fine, we'll call your bluff, and they moved in. But Russia did everything they could to avoid doing this. And in fact, the Communist Party in Russia wanted them to do it in 2014. Right. And Putin and the leadership said no. So people who have it in their head that this is Russia being imperialistic, like Putin wants to conquer these people and enslave them, that is just not what happened. So
in retrospect, they probably should have, given the situation. But whatever, hindsight is 2020. When a country steps in to defend its allies, that's what we're supposed to do, regardless. I mean, that's the situation. So yeah, it is unfortunate. What's
one thing I've told people, right? I mean, first of all, like, you look at what the Ukrainian government is doing. One thing they're doing is they're tearing down World War II memorials because they don't think that the Soviet Union and those forces were right. Now, in the United States, we don't like Confederate memorials and such, but imagine that we had a president who was so right wing and so sympathetic to the Nazis, he was going around and tearing down our World War II memorials. There'd be riots in the streets. Another thing that I tell people is, imagine that we had a president in the United States, or a government. Imagine that we had a racist governor in Texas who declared that speaking Spanish was a crime, and he started dragging Mexican Americans or Chicano Americans into court for speaking their own language. We wouldn't stand for that. We'd say it's unbelievable racism. Well, that's what's been happening to the people of Donetsk and Lugansk for the past 8 years. They have been getting tickets. They've been dragged into court for speaking their own language. Not only have they had their memorials to the fight against fascism torn down and their World War II commemoration parades outlawed, but on top of that, they've been dragged into court for speaking their own language. I mean, this is pretty extreme. And again, Russia tried not to do this. So, when people, and even, let's say hypothetically, even if this was an act of Russian aggression, according to Lenin's definition, that wouldn't be imperialism, because imperialism is a system. It's not a country doing a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. So even if they're baddies.
Right.
Even if they're baddies. Yeah, it's just an unfortunate situation. It is important for people to really understand the way that global capital operates. And I think the role that, as an American, this country has in that. And, all of the fear mongering around Russia and China, like, these people are not our enemies. They never have been. They never will be, It's really a sleight of hand, and the demonization of these nations is really a bad thing for just your ordinary American person. So I just hope that with this and looking at this, people will think a little bit more clearly about how they speak about these countries and any, potential conflicts that they do or come into, because that is inevitable. And unfortunately, nations will have conflicts. And I was thinking too about this, like what you're describing is that's been happening in the Ukraine. This is an issue of national sovereignty. And within the Soviet Union, there was kind of this system of integrating all of these different nations into the main country, and which is another thing to look at. And like, I remember learning from Lenin about what a nation is, how that's constituted, and what rights a nation has, and how a nation should kind of be integrated into a larger country. And even the Russian Federation itself has different nations included.
Yes.
So even the US has different nations included in it, actually. So we want to get into that as well. But I think that's something for people to maybe look into as well. Like, what is a nation?
Mm-hmm.
What is a nation, and like, what rights do these people have? And it's so interesting. Like, people want the Ukraine to have their sovereignty as a nation, but what are they doing to the smaller nations included in the land that they are currently occupying?
And that was a speech, the speech that Putin gave when the intervention began. One thing he pointed out is that the borders of Ukraine were drawn by the Bolsheviks, by the communists. I mean, there were no borders between Ukraine and Russia at the time.
Right.
Tsar existed, and it was Lenin, and then later Stalin, and eventually Khrushchev, who kept expanding the borders. And so it's kind of ironic that all of these things that are being done in Ukraine to kind of break with the Soviet past, they're all being done in the name of de-Sovietification. And Putin said, well, if you want real de-Sovietification, that would mean Ukraine just kind of goes away, because the communists are the ones that, Ukraine didn't have a written language, right? It was just kind of considered a dialect of Russian. It was like speaking Russian with an accent or something. And it was because of the Bolsheviks, they went out of their way to make sure there was a written Ukrainian language, so that Ukrainian, people would be taught to speak their own specific language. The Bolsheviks created that. And that is one point that Putin makes. And I don't know if he's right or wrong. I'm not from this part of the world. I don't speak any of the languages. And the last thing I would ever want to do is try to tell somebody that they don't have the right to nationhood or something like that. But one point that Putin often does make is that the Bolsheviks did have this obsession with declaring people to be different nationalities. And that weakened the Soviet Union in the long term, right? That the Bolsheviks were constantly going around and saying, well, you're a nation, you're a nation, you're a nation. And that by doing that, they kind of laid seeds of division. They weren't focusing on, well, we're all from this part of the world. We all have a common background. And Putin might be right about that. I just don't know. I don't speak any of the languages, and I can't really comment on that. But like, for example, like Belarus, that means white Russian. That's what that means, right? So the name has Russia in the name. It's Belarus, white Russia. And that these regions, these dialects, these languages were not all considered to be like a separate nation until the Bolsheviks came along, and they really emphasized opposition to national oppression. And Stalin, you remember, was not Russian. He was from Georgia. Right. He was a Georgian. Yeah. And they made a really big point of, that Stalin was from an oppressed nationality. And that's why Stalin wrote the book on the national question. That was the main book the Bolsheviks published. So it's interesting to think about. But that was a big breakthrough that Lenin had, was recognizing the right of oppressed nations to determine their own destiny, and how there can be national liberation struggles against imperialism.
It's interesting to me. I did study Russian in school when I was much younger. Don't ask me to speak much of it. I can say a few things, but
you're from Alaska, right? So they teach it there, right?
Yes, I no longer live in Alaska, but I did grow up there. So it's not really required, but it is the second most commonly spoken language, apart from English. And there are many communities where that's what they speak as their first language. There are little Russian settlements that are just kind of their own communities. It's still very Russian in some ways.
I had no idea about that. I know it was at one point part of Russia, but I didn't know that there were still like Russian communities and stuff. That is fascinating. So I grew up with a little bit of a fascination about Russia because of just, the people that were around, dealt with them. And, but I have to say the Russians in the lower 48 just aren't as good. Oh.
Right. Russian Americans, I should say. But yeah, my teacher, though, she was a Ukrainian woman. So, and she was from the Soviet Union. And so she had a very interesting kind of perspective on everything. But I just, I think it's just a shame that things are going as they are right now. And I do hope that this conflict ends soon, and that Americans are not involved.
Yes.
So that to me is just, but the reason we are is because it's within our financial interests as a nation. Use that in quotations. I almost forgot about this in the book. Okay. I did want to talk about economism, but actually, let's go there first. So, and I just am not wrapping my head around this enough, but like, what is it? What does it mean, Caleb?
Well, I criticize the way Bob Avakian talks about it, because if you
Right.
read their rhetoric, Marxism is all about jobs and wages and the economy and unemployment and living standards and surplus value and the tendency of the falling rate of profit and overproduction. Marxism is all about economics. But Bob Avakian and the RCP, most of their rhetoric has nothing to do with economics. They simply talk about, the government is very oppressive, and when we violently overthrow it, when we're in charge, then we're going to make it good. And they've kind of taken the economics out of Marxism. Their justification for that is they say, well, we reject economism. And in Bob Avakian's autobiography, he talks about breaking with economism as being the great achievement of the RCP. And he gives like 3 different definitions of it, and they're all incorrect. Economism is a term that Lenin used to refer to forces that are not really calling for the overthrow of capitalism anymore. Forces that just kind of go with whatever the trade union struggle is doing, right? That's what Lenin meant by it. And the book, What Is to Be Done, is largely a critique of economism. That at the time that Lenin was organizing, most of the people in Russia who called themselves Marxists were what he called trade union secretaries. They were involved in the labor movement, and that when there would be a strike or an uprising or something like that, they would run to it and say, oh, we're a political party and we support you. They'd be lending a political character to the economic struggle. And that was their contribution. And Lenin called that bowing to spontaneity. And he said, no, you need to be giving leadership. You need to be explaining that the problem is the system. You need to be organizing for revolution. You shouldn't just be engaging in tailism, bowing to spontaneity, or economism. You should be offering revolutionary leadership. But that's not taking the economics out of Marxism. That's not what Lenin was advocating.
Right.
They take these statements that Lenin made from What Is to Be Done, and they blow them up into, we don't ever talk about economics. And that is, especially in our time when we're seeing the breakdown of the capitalist system due to technological advancement, which is exactly what Karl Marx wrote about how technology eliminates workers from the assembly line. Workers can't buy back the products they're producing. We stand outcast and starving amid the wonders we have made. This is exactly what capital is all about. This is exactly what Marx was writing about, and they don't talk about it. Instead, they talk about how the government is oppressive because of police brutality, because of wars, and so we need to overthrow it and get down with the revolution. That's not Marxism. Marxism is an economic theory in its essence. That is really what it is. I mean, Marx started studying philosophy, and then he got into politics, but ultimately he spent the bulk of his life studying and writing about economics.
Right. But I guess for me, thinking about the RCP and just what I've seen in terms of their activism, they seem to tail popular movements. I mean, that seems to be what they do. Maybe it's not the trade union movement, but like any other like popular uprising that's happening in the country, they seem to be on it. Like any kind of thing.
As long as it's from the left, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, without the economic class basis of that, I mean, is it?
Right.
And that the other thing,
from the Democrat Party side, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I feel it's I mean, my history, when I was younger, I was involved with Radical Women. I never was part of a political party, but they have that relationship with the Freedom Socialist Party, and they were very progressive. I guess it would say, like, their politics, and they were there kind of being that way well before a lot of other groups were. I mean, they were very pro-woman, pro-gay, decades before, a lot of other organizations kind of followed suit. So in a way, that is commendable, but I kind of, I wonder about these organizations, that they lose something when the class element and the economics aren't at the center of what they're doing. And I guess economism, I wanted to bring up, because I've heard this term and I wanted your opinion about it, but class reductionism. How does it relate to that? Is it similar? Because, I hear when you kind of say like, or when you try to bring us back to center when we're talking about like all of these various social ills and, issues that people are facing that aren't maybe are related to things other than class, like maybe sex or maybe race. When we try to bring that back or kind of focus on class and economics, I hear that kind of thrown around. So I wanted your opinion about how, that relates, and, what is it about leftists that they're so willing to give up the thing that is unifying among the working class? Because like we all have different struggles. We come from different, at least in the US, we're from different nations. We came here, we're different, we're male and female, we're we're facing different things in our life, but the orientation we have to the means of production, if we're working class, is the same. So that's unifying. It brings people together. So I'm wondering like why so many groups and organizations do everything but focus on that.
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, that term class reductionism, when I first heard it, I was just like, wait a second. Like, because, there are some examples that I saw, like years ago when some of these Marxist groups were still bigger. I think, the Progressive Labor Party, the PLP, I would see them. And at sometimes at rallies, they would chant things like white power and black power are the same. Racism is the boss's game. Well, that you could argue that's class reductionism, because white power and black power are not the same. If you look at the role of white supremacist organizations versus the role of black liberation groups, they're not the same. So that's like actual class reductionism, but that's extremely rare, right? That is an extremely rare thing that you see, where there's groups that just say, well, we completely reject everything except, class and worker struggle. That's very, very, very rare. But these people,
right,
the bread tube crowd, right? They use the term class reductionism as a reason that one should never talk about economics and one should never unify with anyone who does not agree with you on every social issue. If someone has a question about, abortion or gay marriage or trans stuff or, or affirmative action or whatever, if someone doesn't agree with you, you must immediately denounce and disavow them. And if you would work with them around an economic issue, you are therefore a class reductionist, which is this word that means bad person. And that is so much of what social media discourse is reduced to. There are many different categories, Terry, of bad person. I think we're on like many of, we fit many of them, I think, according to these people. But
I have no problem admitting I'm a bad person.
Right. But there are all these lists of, if you're a class reductionist or you're a trans erasing radical feminist or you're a, oh my goodness, there's so many of them. What are they? You're a conspiracy theorist. You're you're all these things, right? And it's like this really long list of things. And if you're a good liberal, your job is to make sure none of the people you know or associate with are any of these things. If they are, you must cut them out of your life immediately and announce to the whole social media that you disavow this person because they are this thing. And, it's just like they divide the world into the good people and the bad people. And they want points on social media for being one of the good people. And they want you to cut all the bad people out of your life. And this is naive, childish politics, and it's destroying families. It's destroying communities. It's making life
destroying the fabric of society.
Yeah,
it's very destructive. And I think that it's very important to think, with your politics, such as they are they constructive? Are you building or are you destroying?
Yeah.
And what is the end of it? Like, is something being built here, or are you just destroying?
Yeah, are you actually accomplishing anything, or are you just kind of trying to get points on social media? I think social media is probably the most effective mind control operation in history.
Yeah, it's messed
And
with my head.
yeah, and it's sinister because we have a lot of people who are so desperate to please these anonymous, a lot of these accounts aren't even real on Twitter. We know it's something like 80% are not real. I heard 80% of the accounts are fake. Right. So, we have all these people that are trying to get the approval of these people that aren't real at the expense of real people in their lives, real relationships that they might have. And it's toxic, and it's hurting our culture. It's hurting our society. I think it has a lot to do with the suicide rate, the drug addiction rate. A lot of the problems we're facing are rooted in this, and that it's very good at manipulating you. And if it can't manipulate you one way, it manipulates you another way, and we've seen that in that, first, I mean, you remember how anyone who was a socialist or a communist used to be weird. I mean, no one ever used to think about
Oh
those
yeah.
things. And
Exactly.
but then things started to change. The economy got worse and people were angry. So then they invented this way you can be a socialist or a communist and not challenge the status quo. They invented Vosh and BreadTube and ContraPoints and all of that. But then people like you and I came along, and we didn't agree with this, right?
We were around before them.
Yeah, and we saw that this is not our movement. This is not what we stand for.
No.
Then they created another layer, right, of folks that are, they're anti-woke, but they're bullying people. They're promoting a kind of, nasty, very masculine culture that's about kind of tearing people down and stuff like that. We're not with them either, right? And that there are so many different maneuvers they've invented to kind of distract people and point them in so many different directions. And that social media is very much designed. And, Peter Coffin, who I really like, a good friend of mine, he was just in Tampa today attending the Uhuru court rulings, hearings, from what I understand, for the Uhuru movement. He talks about how a lot of it is just about cultivating a fandom. It's not about actually building any organization. It's just about kind of giving people a commodified identity, something that they can, to be a socialist means you buy a socialist shoes, you listen to socialist music, you take socialist selfies and post it on your socialist Facebook.
You block and unfollow the right people.
Yeah, and it's just a way to be something and to define yourself. It's almost like, the way people were goths or punks or whatever preps or whatever they used to be back in the 90s, and that's not helpful. We need to build real organizations to actually change things, especially as our society enters a long-term state of crisis, as we inch closer toward World War III and the low-wage police state. We need to build real organizations, and we're not seeing that. Instead, we're seeing a lot of social media whiz-bang stuff that's not helpful.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm defending Bob Avakian here, because, for all of his faults, he has dedicated his life to building an organization, and it still exists. And many people who tried to do the same thing, the RCP was founded in 1975. Back then, there were about 6 different new communist parties that were formed to be aligned with China. Every single one of them is gone except for the RCP, So to his credit, he has held a group of people together who've made great sacrifices, have gotten arrested, have gotten beaten up, who, have endured all kinds of attacks. I mean, he fled the country and lived in exile for many years, and he's held a group of people together that are capable of accomplishing things and having an impact on American political discourse, and that must be admired. And as much as I disagree with some of his views, I have to admire him as an organizer, because that shows that there's a level of passion that he has, his ability to keep his group together. And that is something we should learn from. And that if you just go around, if you disagree with somebody, if someone's your political opponent or enemy, naming their flaws is easy because you don't like them, right? So all their flaws. The challenge should be to name their strengths. What can you actually learn from them? And you gain a lot more as someone who's trying to improve themselves and understand how the world works. You gain a lot more by, if there's somebody you really don't like, but they're accomplishing a lot, look at why. Why are they achieving this? What do they do for their audience? What do they do for the people that they associate? Where is their strength, right? That's something that I would challenge people to do. If there's somebody in your life who's your rival or your opponent, learn from them.
Right. That's wise. I mean, you should know your enemy. Right. I mean, and of course, Bob isn't an enemy. I think that's but it's important to have an understanding of people's strengths and weaknesses, especially our own. I almost forgot about this, but you brought up the new atheist movement. Because apparently I didn't realize this, but they had again, like I said, my observation has been that they tail behind these different movements that come up, and that's kind of, it's one of those things that kind of is off-putting about the RCP. But you had brought up that, and I thought that was just so interesting because that was around the time that I got started on YouTube. The new atheist thing was so huge, and actually it was like seeing like some atheists like their channels that kind of inspired me to start my own channel. Oh, so wow. Yeah, I know. Well, it's been a long, journey, but sure. Yeah, they were very prominent on the, YouTubes back in the day. And there were a lot of interesting times. So that was around the time that I came onto YouTube in 2008. So I just thought it was interesting that you brought them up. I don't know why I just read that again. I just was like, I guess just really kind of excited to see that brought up here, and that the new atheists, so many of them were very conservative. And, there were even some of them that were very pro-imperialist, like they weren't even, they were the OG incels. I am seeing some of the, oh yeah, the Amazing Atheist came for me like many years ago. That was one of the reasons my channel blew up, actually, because he made a video about me. So
wow.
Yeah, it was awful. Oh, it was awful. The comments, it just never ended. The hate was so awful for so long. It never ended. And then that channel ended up getting destroyed. It got hacked. So I have my new channel, Terri Strange, that I've had since then. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting that they were kind of tailing that and wanting to influence it. But obviously they didn't have much luck, because I thought too at that time, like, atheists might be interested in Marxism. And, at that time I was kind of, maybe trying to tailor some of my content to them, although it never really worked out. But
well, you have to understand what was going on back then, right? Because I have spent a lot of time trying to understand how our society and how our political conversation has evolved in the way it did. The Bush presidency, the neoconservatives, right? Yeah, they invaded Iraq and destroyed a major oil producing country, and that had the result of driving the oil prices up, which made a lot of money for ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. However, it also gave Russia a huge boost, because the way Putin fixed the Russian economy is he put oil and gas under state public ownership and then used the revenue to rebuild the Russian economy. It also gave a huge boost to socialism in Latin America because of Hugo Chavez, right? Because oil, was the main source of revenue there.
Right.
And then at the time that the U.S. invaded Iraq, Iran was drifting closer to the United States because Iraq was their enemy from the Iraq-Iran war. But then Bush, while he invaded Iraq, he called Iran the axis of evil. He named them as one of the axis of evil. But Iran is an oil exporting country as well, so their oil revenue shot up. And so three major rivals of the United States all got a huge boost in their oil revenue. And Libya was, Gaddafi was still running Libya. Libya also had a huge boost in its oil revenue, and Gaddafi became the president of the African Union. And so many of the U.S. imperialists were saying, okay, we took action that maybe benefited us financially a little bit, but it also boosted our major rivals. Then the other thing you have to remember is that in the Middle East, some of the main allies of the United States have been Islamic extremists. The Muslim Brotherhood is a primary CIA ally. The CIA was, they used the Muslim Brotherhood to fight against Abdel Nasser in Egypt, to fight against Bashar Assad in Syria, to fight against Saddam Hussein, etc. The Muslim Brotherhood is very much, and it's funded by Qatar and Turkey, but they do work with the CIA to carry out their operations. But many of Bush's allies in the evangelical Christian right And you remember at this time, the message that they had was that Islam is an evil religion. Muslims are all terrorists. We need to support Israel at all costs. And that Bush, in one of his speeches, actually referred to the war on terror as a crusade, which,
Yeah.
has a very negative connotation in the Middle East and in the Muslim world. And so the Muslim, allies of the United States were pretty horrified by all the evangelical Christian pastors that were working with Bush and were saying nasty things about them, and Bush calling it a crusade. And the rivals, the geopolitical rivals of the United States, all got a huge boost from the oil prices rising. And the U.S. financial crisis was on the horizon. And then you'll remember that right as Bush was leaving office, Israel invaded Lebanon. And Hezbollah, which is the revolutionary Islamic organization in Lebanon, just kicked Israel's ass, just destroyed the Israeli invaders and drove them out. And that the whole Muslim world was cheering for Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is funded by Iran, right? They're Shia Muslims that are funded by Iran. So the whole Muslim world was basically cheering for Iran. Iran had lots of money because of the oil prices being shot up. Venezuela was becoming, Hugo Chavez was spreading his ideology all over Latin America. Russia was back in business, etc. So in that context, my understanding is that there was a section of the American deep state that said these evangelical Christian people, they are causing a problem for U.S. imperialism, right? And so we had Barack Hussein Obama.
Oh, right? No.
Muslim school, right? And they made a really big deal about how his middle name was Hussein, and he had gone to a Muslim school, right? And he became the new president, and he went over to Europe and tried to repair relations with Europe that hadn't agreed with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, right? He spoke in Berlin during his campaign. And I believe it was around the time that Barack Obama was in ascendancy that out of nowhere, Richard Dawkins was getting his books reviewed in the New York Times and was doing interviews, and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. And the new atheist movement was largely, it was that there was a section of the American state apparatus of the neoconservative alliance, which was the evangelical Christian right, that had gotten out of control and caused a lot of problems for U.S. imperialism. So a section of the deep state decided to give them a pretty hard punch in the mouth. And, and the technology, information revolution, social media, gave them a vehicle through which to do so much more effectively. The evangelical Christian right, they still exist. You still have Mike Pence, you still have Nikki Haley, people like that, but they're much weaker than they used to be. And that is because a section of the ruling class decided they needed to go. And so they mobilized the new atheist movement, gave them a lot of attention and publicity in order to push back against them. But why are they new atheists? And this is the point that I make in the book, is that the word atheist comes out of the French Revolution, right? And that France was a Catholic country and the peasants were being oppressed and they believed the king had the divine right. And so being an atheist meant you were opposing, feudalism and the structures that kept people down. Well, the new atheists of our time, the new atheists see things very, very differently. Right? In their view, God is bad because God would mandate you be nice to other people and do acts of kindness and not be purely selfish. And that their atheism draws not from Marx, not from the tradition of reason and science and the revolutionary intelligentsia of Europe, but rather from Friedrich Nietzsche, from Ayn Rand, from Leo Strauss. And it's very much a philosophy that rejects compassion, kindness, and empathy, is very much an advocate of libertarian economics and in some cases of blatant racism. The big book that made Richard Dawkins famous is called The Selfish Gene, which is a Malthusian rant. I mean, it's just basically the idea of survival of the fittest. Some people are superior to others. And it's an attempt to interpret human history with biology to argue some people are just better than others. And Sam Harris and others have promoted racial pseudoscience and eugenics and all of this. And that people even talk that there was almost, they used to talk about there was a pipeline of young white male from an evangelical Christian family. When he's 14 or 15, he gets on the internet and he becomes a new atheist. So he becomes a new atheist and decides he's smarter than his evangelical family. And so then from there, he becomes a libertarian because, libertarian economics, right? Ludwig von Mises and all of that. And then from there, as he's getting more frustrated and as he's arguing on the internet with people that are, advocates of social justice and all of that, then he starts to tamper in the racial pseudoscience. And that is actually the profile of your typical alt-right member. That
Yeah.
trajectory is your typical Richard Spencer supporter at the time Trump was elected. That was what they were. They went through this pipeline from the new atheist movement to white supremacy, which I think is interesting.
I mean, I've witnessed it firsthand with so many people I knew that were part of that community at the time, just being a YouTuber, just people that I, knew. So many of them got caught up in, way too caught up in that stuff. And of course, I just, so many wasted young lives as well, because, these people, and again, I've seen it brought up in the chat here briefly, but like they've mentioned the incels, the men's rights activists. This has all atomized a lot of young, white, evangelical background men.
Yeah.
They've basically been just atomized and isolated and made these young men who, had they followed, in their parents' footsteps, would have had families, would have been contributing to society and would have, possibly made a positive impact in their community, as opposed to being a racist troll. So like, it's just, I've seen it happen with so many of them. And it's just, I still the compassion in me is like, okay, just hoping that these people eventually will wake up and realize, that it does seem to be there have been, and you and I have talked, personally about the fact that there are these so many different ideologies in place right now that people can get sucked into, right and left, that seem to be about isolation. Mm-hmm. And really about human destruction, because again, there's no growth happening. People are not living normal lives. They're not having relationships. They're not having families. They're not eating properly. They're not, they're panicking about the end of the world, and they're not living life. Mm-hmm. And because they're not actually participating in the world, it's just so very easy. It's just like they've been neutralized as human beings. I don't know how else to say it. They've been totally robbed of their life, their essence, just because they've been sucked into these extreme weird ideologies on the internet. And it does seem to exist in so many different ways. I mean, you talked about climate alarmism in the book, for example. I can't tell you the number of people I know that are just frozen because they're paranoid that the world's going to end. And I'm like, you try to reason with them, like, well, if it's going to end, you better live your life. But there's no reasoning, because they're in this loop of fear and self-destruction, and it's fed by the social media. And we're getting off a topic though, so let's get back to the book.
Sure. I mean, towards the end of the book, that's what I really thank Bob Avakian.
You do kind of talk about,
because I would probably be one of those people if I hadn't got recruited into a movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I really am thankful that there was a movement I could join when I was a teenager, and that I could, not just argue about communism with people on the internet, but I could actually join a group and learn to go out and do outreach and, build protests and such. And that many young people need a movement desperately. They need a real organization, a real community they can join. And this online stuff that is supposed to take the place of that is toxic and destructive. And that, part of the reason I'm so dedicated to building the Center for Political Innovation is I see every day so many young people that really need a movement. They really need a movement they can join. And that is what I'm determined to build. I am determined to build a movement. That is my mission. I get paid. I do my job as a journalist, but my life's dedication is turning whatever, prestige or internet prowess or widespread audience I have into actually building a movement, because people need a movement. The country needs a movement. The world needs a movement. And many young people need a movement right now. And if there wasn't a movement, I wouldn't be alive right now. And I know that, right? If it wasn't for the fact that I joined a movement when I was very young, I didn't just become an internet troll.
Right. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I really wanted to discuss in the book, but I just want to reiterate again that I was really appreciative that this resource exists now.
Okay.
Because it is a resource. It has so much information about their history, about who Bob Avakian is. Because that's the other thing too, like with people who've come to me about the RCP, like they're kind of put off by him. Is that, can I make that, they because I don't know if I want to call it a cult of personality exactly around him, but like they kind of feel like the way he's promoted when they go to like their events or that kind of thing, they're kind of like, whoa, like it's off-putting to them.
Sure.
So like I said, I don't have personal experience actually going to any of their events, so I can't say that's from my own experience, but I have had people come to me and say these things to me. So
sure. And I think that an aesthetic critique, I think you're right, that some of the ways they promote him on a personal level can be a little gross sometimes. And I think you're not the only person to say that. But let me ask you this. What did you think about when I talked about the French intelligence connection?
Yeah, him being an asset. I like that because, oh, I appreciate that too, because it's so easy to like call someone an agent. I've heard that, you know, it's, and so much of the time, like people are just, they are who they are. And because their behavior is predictable, like you say, they're manipulated by forces outside their control. So like you may not have done anything personally as an activist or a leader or anything, but other people have come to you and influenced you indirectly to behave in certain ways. And I thought it was so interesting to kind of think about French imperialism, because I don't think about it that much. It does come up from time to time when I think of certain nations or that kind of thing. But, you know, in my day-to-day life, France, I think because the US has had this kind of contentious relationship with France in some ways. You brought up the Bush era, and obviously France opposed the war in Iraq. So I thought that was interesting because he came back to the US around the time, right? If I remember correctly from the book. So he came back to the US around the time of the invasion of Iraq, and France was, you know, they were trading with Iraq, and they had, you know, actually a French scientist was killed when they bombed one of these nuclear facilities where they're trying to develop nuclear power. So I thought that was interesting. I appreciated learning about their work with Mumia Abu-Jamal too. So yeah,
I mean,
I love the whole part about like learning more about the French.
I think that what I revealed in that book, and I will say, I'm not revealing anything too much here, but you know, there are other forces I talked to that have you know, known that he was an asset of French intelligence for quite some time, you know, and I mean, I just kind of made the case in this book. It's pretty clear that the RCP is not the only organization among Western communists that has been infiltrated by French intelligence. And I think that French intelligence and French covert manipulation of leftist politics, it has been a big problem, especially in light of the Russia-Ukraine thing, because France is on the side of the United States. They're against Ukraine. And that during the Bush years, they were against the war in Iraq, and that they, you know, the French, right?
Did you say France is against Ukraine?
France is taking the side of the United States against Russia, you know.
Okay. Yes,
you know, they're against Russia and Ukraine. They're members of NATO. And so they're taking the imperialist position. And that, you know, during the 90s, the French government, they supported Mumia Abu-Jamal. The French government has stated that it is one of their efforts around the world. They want to abolish the death penalty. They are against the death penalty. So am I. Good. You know, but that led them to support Mumia Abu-Jamal. There's a street in Paris named after Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia Abu-Jamal is a citizen of 25 different French cities that have granted him citizenship, including Paris. And I also know, I used to work with the Workers' World Party, the International Action Center. Most of the money that paid for their protests supporting Mumia Abu-Jamal came from France, you know, and that for the French government, they decided that they supported Mumia Abu-Jamal and they wanted to stop the execution. Good, right? Just like opposing the war in Iraq is good, but France is still is an imperialist country. And
it's good, but what is their interest in him specifically? Like what
I think that it's really.
I've always
Go on. I'm sorry.
wondered
I don't
that.
want to interrupt you. I apologize.
I've always wondered that. Like, it's great, that France has supported him. I think they've been instrumental in keeping him alive, honestly.
Good.
But why?
Well, I mean, it
Why
appears
him?
there is a rivalry
Mm,
among the imperialists.
yeah.
The British and the American imperialists and the imperialists of the European mainland have been at odds with each other quite a bit. And a lot of it relates to nuclear power, right? France is a huge supporter of nuclear power. The French nuclear energy plants are government owned. And the Americans and the British control the oil markets. And if countries are developing nuclear power, they're not buying oil. And this has been a long-standing division. Whereas the Americans and the British are all about control of the oil markets, and the French are pushing back against that and promoting nuclear power. And that's why France was helping Saddam Hussein to develop nuclear energy in the 80s. And then Israel, in coordination with the United States, destroyed the nuclear power facility and killed a French citizen. That's why Greenpeace, the environmental organization, has gone out of its way to target the French government. And from what I understand, the French government has retaliated and killed a few Greenpeace activists over the years, right? And that the French, and to some degree or other, the Germans, they resent the Americans and the British kind of running the world, that they're the lesser of the imperialists. And that, for those of you who may not be aware, Bob Avakian moved to France. He fled the United States to Paris in 1982. And he applied to be a political exile in France. And he made a big show of doing that at the United Nations, saying, I am a political exile. I want political exile status. And the French government denied it. But he stayed in France. Now,
that was curious to me as well. Like, he wasn't granted that, but he must have been granted some sort of.
Yeah, somebody needs to ask Bob. That's probably why he doesn't do interviews. Someone needs to just say, so Bob, you were denied political exile status. How did you remain in France for 20 years?
Yeah.
He must have made some kind of arrangement. It's obviously difficult to live in a country without papers, but if you go there and then announce to the government, I want this kind of visa, and they say no, you're going to get deported. So why was he able to stay in France for 20 years? And in the book, he talks about how when he arrived in Paris, he was kind of brought into this whole community of communist exiles that they have recruited in Paris from around the world, from South America, from Asia, from Africa. There is a whole network of communist exiles who live in Paris, and they brought him into that. Well, that raises some questions. Eldridge Cleaver, who was Bob Avakian's personal friend, lived in Paris until he returned to the United States and became a Republican. And Bob Avakian talks about that in his autobiography, and how Eldridge Cleaver basically said, we're not going to see any more revolution. So he became a Republican so he could come back home. And the other thing is that Bob is not the only American radical activist who has mysteriously showed up in Paris. And I talk about.
You mentioned Ira Einhorn.
Yeah, the unicorn killer. Is that wild? I mean.
Yeah, I thought.
What was your reaction to the part about the unicorn killer?
I mean, I thought it was good to include. I obviously knew about him and his history, and the fact that he had killed his girlfriend, and that had been something that had been, I spent time as a radical feminist for many years, kind of immersed in that world. So there's a lot of anger and resentment towards environmentalists in some ways, or like mainstream environmentalists, as I would say, because of, his connection and the fact that he was a woman killer. And I thought it was so funny that he had accused the CIA of killing her. So
why did
found
the
that
French
interesting.
government bend over backwards to prevent his extradition? First of all, how did his bail money? This is like what year is it? 1978, 1979, 1980, around the same time Bob fled to Paris, right? You have Ira Einhorn, who kills his girlfriend. The police find her body like mummified in the closet of his apartment. And so then he's on trial for murder, and members of city council and all these prominent Democrats get up and say, oh, he's not a flight risk. And they give him bail money. His bail money is paid for by a wealthy family from Canada, like this billionaire family from Canada. And then right before his trial is about to begin, he disappears. And
Right.
no one hears from him until 1997, and he's living in France. And he's been living in France under the name Eugene Mellon. That's what he's calling himself. He has a new wife from Switzerland, and he's been writing for magazines under a different name. He's like been working for American magazines and stuff under a different name. And so, of course, he's arrested. But then the French government, and I understand it was the FBI who found him. Like the FBI went to France and like under the nose of the French government discovered him. So they finally get him. And then the French government put up like the biggest extradition fight you've ever seen to prevent Ira Einhorn from coming back to the United States. And they forced the state of Pennsylvania to pass a special law that says that if someone is convicted of murder or is charged with murder and flees to France, they will not be possibly sentenced to death if they come back. And that was a way then the French government said, okay, because you have agreed, you've made this special law that he won't be sentenced to death. They finally extradited him. And he came back. And then at his trial, and this is where it gets very weird, he says the CIA killed his girlfriend, and he goes on for hours and hours and hours talking about CIA mind control operations that he was involved in, and all kinds of detail of CIA involvement with the environmental movement and workshops that he and his followers were going to that were run by the CIA, where mind control experiments were done on them, and all kinds of shit that he reads into the record. And he's ultimately then convicted and goes to the prison until he dies during the pandemic.
Right. Well, I don't doubt any of that, but I do think he killed his girlfriend.
Yeah, I think he did too.
Yeah, but it's too probable that he did,
but that still raises questions about the CIA stuff, and the CIA involvement in his activist circle. That I don't think he was necessarily lying about
France, what information are they gleaming from him, for their own intelligence? So it is very, very interesting little bit of thing to kind of mull over. I definitely love that stuff because it was fascinating.
Well, and
going into that, and yeah,
and the activism of the RCP while Bob is in Paris lines up exactly with what the French government is doing. They're supporting Mumia Abu-Jamal and trying to get the death penalty outlawed. That's what the RCP is focused on. They're opposed to the war in Iraq. So is he. When Harold Pinter won the Nobel Prize for Literature as a playwright, he used his speech, his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, to just give an anti-Bush tirade. The RCP republished it in their newspaper, and then the French government granted, Harold Pinter the next year, made him a member of the Legion d'Honneur, which is like the highest award you can get in. It's like their version of the Nobel Prize. You also remember Michael Moore, his movie Fahrenheit 9/11. Right. It got the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. And it seems very clearly that Bob, the RCP to some degree or other was an asset of French intelligence. And what's also very interesting is since I've published this, a number of people in Russia have come to me and said, this is very good that you published this, Caleb, because just as Russia moved into Ukraine, all the Trotskyites in Russia fled to Paris. All these Trotskyites that were protesting against Putin and saying, well, we're for communism and we're against Stalin, they got on a plane and fled to Paris. What a coincidence, isn't it? And this is what leads me to believe that French intelligence has infiltrated a number of communist organizations throughout the world. And that because U.S. imperialism and British imperialism were the main threat, and the Soviet Union, which was the main ally of communist groups around the world, was declining, it seems like the French kind of swept in with their program of bringing exiles in, to Paris, exiles from Chile, exiles from various countries, that they swept in and that they infiltrated a number of communist groups. And it kind of worked out okay because they were against the war in Iraq and they're against the death penalty. But now that NATO is fighting Russia, they're on the pro-imperialist side. And I will add that the French Communist Party is, here in the United States, the communist groups are very small. But in France,
they're huge in France.
Yeah, it's got millions of members. It's got seats in parliament. And it's basically a wing of the French government. I mean, the main newspaper in France, Libération, that used to be the Communist Party newspaper. Jean-Paul Sartre was the editor of it, and then it split. But that's like the New York Times in France, right? It's formerly the Communist Party newspaper. L'Humanité, which is the Communist Party newspaper, is a newspaper that's widely studied. And the French Communist Party supported the bombing of Libya, supports the bombing of Mali, and it votes in the parliament to send weapons to Ukraine. But just like the RCP, it's critical, right? It's saying like,
Mm.
oh, let's not go too far, but it still blames Russia, which is the exact same position that the RCP takes. And so you look at it, it seems pretty clear that Bob Avakian is an asset of French intelligence. But what's even more interesting is before that, it looks like some of the far right wing were using him against China, and I talk about that in the book. We probably don't have time to get into that, but you know, but
Let's something to the imagination too of people to read it as well. Yeah, they got to read it. There is so much interesting stuff in this book. Very, very fascinating. I don't know where to begin, honestly. Like, I didn't know what to expect, but I'm glad that you wrote it. I guess, I did have another thing that I wanted to bring up as well, was the fact that they endorsed Biden. That's, I didn't know that. That's wild.
I got the email because when I was around the RCP, their position was you cannot vote at all.
Really?
They said, first of all, voting gives legitimacy to the government, and we want to overthrow it. And then their second reason was that
ultra leftism, maybe.
A little bit, yeah. But their other reason was that if you the juries are drawn from voter registration, and that if you went to be on a jury, you might have to answer questions about the RCP, and that would violate their secrecy as an organization. So because of that, RCP members were not allowed to vote, because then they could get called for jury duty. And I understood, like, at one point, members of the RCP would be expelled if they registered to vote, because it was like that it was considered a security issue, right? So they have been anti-voting for the longest time. So I remember in 2020, I am on the RCP's email list. I get all their emails, and this email, it's like special message from Bob Avakian concerning the 2020 elections. And I'm like, like, what is this? Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm reading, and it's just like, Trump is a Nazi, Trump is a racist. I'm like, okay, get to the point. And then I see the bombshell: voting will be one way to secure the defeat of Donald Trump. And I'm just like, whoa, that's big. And it's weird because I noticed that all the bread tubers made a vote for Biden video. ContraPoints made one, Vosh made, it's like all of the people, they all got and it's weird. They didn't have to do it that way, but it was like all of them got a phone call or something that you must make a vote for Biden video, and to see the RCP that has always had this anti-election, anti-voting position do that was just like, wow. I was shocked to see that. And that shows me that they are really, despite taking some anti-imperialist stances, they've really deteriorated as an organization. They're not what they were at one point.
And I just, the alarm, whether you like Trump or not, that he's not a Nazi, and in no way or his policies fascistic. And what we see with the Biden administration is creeping fascism. Very much. Like you brought up the Uhuru People's Movement.
Yeah.
And earlier today, what we're facing in terms of surveillance, in terms of the attack on our liberty, free speech, ability to even protest the government's policies in terms of war, we're facing some very, very strong authoritarian tendencies from this administration, and obviously their economic policies are also very concerning. So it's rather strange to me that can you maybe we could just talk about this, why are people so confused? The bread tube thing.
People have it in their heads that fascism is when people say racist things, or when people build a mass movement or something like that. That's not what fascism is. The essence of fascism is that when capitalism enters a long-term economic crisis, when people are homeless because there are too many houses, when people are hungry because there's too much food, when the means of production are producing so much goods, but the workers are not able to buy it back, and you have just an economic meltdown. This is what's built into capitalism.
Right.
The capitalist system has to figure out how to resolve it. And there becomes a fight in the ruling class about how to resolve it. And fascism is an attempt to resolve an economic crisis by using heavy-handed state power to forcibly degrow the economy.
Right.
That's what fascism is. And that is what Biden believes in, right? He believes in degrowth, and that, the way to solve the crisis is to reduce the population, Malthusianism, eugenics, drive down living standards,
new atheism.
Yeah, and that you have to basically mobilize society to grind everyone, into greater poverty to save the system. And the Nazis did that primarily by creating a slave labor underclass, and putting a big section of the population in concentration camps, putting a big section of the population, into the military, restarting military spending, shaming women out of the workforce. That was a really big aspect of the Nazi economic reboot, is they increased the amount of money that people got for getting married. Like, they gave like a marriage bonus. And then they had a big ad campaign just shaming any woman who would work. They had like posters of women working in a factory. She's like, I'm taking a job away from a good German man who needs to feed his children. And so they shamed women out of the workforce. Right? They put a bunch of people in concentration camps. They restarted military spending, and that's how they were able to kind of reboot the German economy for 5 or 6 years. But then World War II had to break out because it only lasted for 5 years.
You have to grow. The capitalism has to grow. It's just if that's your motive, you have to conquer new markets. So inevitably you're going to have to conquer new nations to do that.
Yeah, and the prison industrial complex in the United States is a similar thing. I mean, that, if Joe Biden wanted to create jobs for American workers, if he banned prison labor, there would be a huge boom, because a lot of these jobs that are not there are not going overseas; they're going into the prison. If someone calls you on the phone to tell you to pay your cable bill or whatever, often that's a prisoner you're talking to. And think about it. That could be someone on the outside who would get paid minimum wage, and instead it's a prisoner who's getting, less than $1 an hour to do it. And then our economy in the United States, part of the way that they prop it up is with massive military spending, but also with prison labor, with also, grinding society into poverty. They're trying to save the capitalist system with degrowth.
Yeah. And Kamala Harris, her, prison connections are unbelievable. It's just kind of amazing to me that anybody could, looking at, going back to 2020, just looking at that, it was so terrifying, worrying about them getting into office, just knowing what would come out of it in terms of who was going to be, getting fed, who was going to be getting deals out of this. And it's been really, really, a difficult few years since they've been in office. And obviously, the economy has suffered due to other forces. I don't know if I really want to use that word, just because of how controversial they seem to be. But, we went through something as a world, and everybody knows what we went through, and it definitely affected the economies of pretty much all the nations.
Yeah, and it put all the small businesses out of power, and it degrew, and it secured the monopoly of Amazon and Walmart and the big corporations. And I will say also that wokism, which is kind of the rallying cry of Biden, is a lot like anti-Semitism. And a lot of people don't realize this, but if you understand anti-Semitism from a Marxist perspective, what anti-Semitism is, it is an attempt to weaponize the resentment of the working class, not against the capitalist system and the ultra-rich, but against the middle class. Right. That's what anti-Semitism is. The stereotypes about Jews are that Jews are doctors, that Jews are lawyers, that Jews are owners of stores, that they're small business owners. Right.
And also that they run everything.
Sure. And that a lot of the stereotypes about Jews that you hear from anti-Semites are stereotypes and resentments that a working class person might have against a middle class person. For example, a wage worker, you get paid every week, every 2 weeks, right? So you're going to be a lot freer with your money because you have a regular paycheck. Whereas a middle class person, right, they probably make more money as a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, but if they own their own practice, everything they have is going to go back into their business. So they're going to be a lot tighter with their money. And that's the stereotype about Jews, is Jews, oh, Jews are cheap or whatever, right? Also, middle class people tend to be more, socially liberal, more open to gay marriage, less religious, more non-conforming. That's also a stereotype, right? And that if you look at it, it's very interesting. In the Pacific, there's a lot of bigotry against ethnically Chinese people. And a lot of the stereotypes about them and the belief that they secretly control the government, that they're all communists, that they're cheap with money, it fits the same trope, and it's mainly because they are middle class. And many people, from a Marxist perspective, have said basically anti-Semitism is kind of weaponizing the resentment that wage working class people might have against the middle class people in their neighborhood, in their community. Right? It's about weaponizing working class resentment against the middle class. And it, of course, is racializing it because there's a racial stereotype or an ethnic stereotype about Jews. And I would argue wokism is very similar because, again, it's not about being against the system and the people who actually have the power. It's about resenting the person you can see in your life who has it slightly better than you. At the end of the day, if you live in a small town, Yeah, and if you live in a small town, the doctor or the lawyer who lives down the street, they're not that much better off than you. They might have more money than you slightly, but you're still living in a small town. You're still, part of middle America. But the millionaires and the billionaires that run the country, who you never see, they're the ones with the real power. But if they can just get you to resent that doctor or that lawyer in your neighborhood, or that person who is white and you're a person of color, or that person who is a man and you're a woman, or that person who is straight and you're LGBT, or that person who, for whatever reason, you perceive as having more privilege than you, right? And there's no real solution there. It's just, isn't it unfair that this person has had a better life than you? Aren't you angry about it? Don't you want to punish this other person? Don't you want to tear them down to make your life a little bit better? And that's really what anti-Semitism is. It's the same kind of mindset. Be mad at a group of people you perceive as having more than you, and just stoke your resentment and anger and use that resentment and anger to push degrowth. To push policies that will make us all poorer. And that's the essence of anti-Semitism. And I would argue that the wokist movement it's the same kind of psychology. It's being used. And so that's why I see Bidenomics and the Biden movement as very fascistic.
Yeah. And also, we have this, I told you about dealing with like a coworker ratting me out years ago because of some of my tweets or like internet presence. I said some things that they didn't like. So, we have this kind of, and it was because it wasn't woke, I guess, or whatever. It wasn't politically correct in whatever they thought I should think as a sovereign individual. But, this happened to me, but I see, it's happening all over the place to all kinds of people. Where they're getting eliminated or canceled. And we talked about it before months ago when you hopped on my stream. We talked about what's happened to David Rovics, for example. Yeah. And he's been accused of anti-Semitism despite being Jewish himself. Make that make sense. And this is so interesting too, because anti-Semitism doesn't even really come up much in terms of like the woke things, like, in terms of real issues. And if you do raise, questions about like anti-Semitism coming into something, you often see it. There's definitely like a hierarchy within it of, I guess, I don't even know how to describe it, because so much of this is just, it's all about having the most up-to-date language. It's not really anything to do with, the character of a person, what they truly feel, how they truly treat people. It's all about, was your language correct?
what we saw with Corbyn in Britain and how Corbyn was just kind of canceled and kicked out of the Labour Party.
Yeah, they did him so dirty.
There was an article that came out that was written by Jonah Goldberg, who's the editor of National Review, and he wrote this article. It was for another publication. I think it was Commentary. It was for one of the more conservative magazines. And the article that he published was called Karl Marx's Jew-Hating Conspiracy Theory. And he argued that all class struggle rhetoric is anti-Semitic, that rich is always code for Jew. And it seems like that is the memo that has gotten sent out by the woke crowd. And that is when they talk about anti-Semitism, they say if you talk about big pharma, if you talk about the military-industrial complex, if you talk about big banks, all of that is code for Jew. And you are therefore a Nazi. And that seems to be how discourse is becoming tainted, is that any class struggle rhetoric is being reinterpreted. And I've had this done to me, I mean, endlessly. People say that whenever I mention banks or finance or imperialism, they say that that's coded anti-Semitism. No, it's not, right? You know, and that basically any populist sentiment is considered to be anti-Semitism. And that's very, very dangerous, but I think that's the way things are progressing, and we see that a lot. And that really, I mean, this woke stuff is not socialism. It's not populist in any way. It's anti-human, right? It's anti-working class, and so they will perceive any genuine socialism, any populism, any class struggle rhetoric as being against them, and they're right. They're right in doing so. What I get frustrated by is that there's a lot of people on the right who are convinced the woke people are communists, and they are not. And go to any communist country and hear something very different than what these woke people promote. And it's quite frustrating to me to hear people try to equate, you know, what Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Mao believed in with what these woke people believe in, because, you know, I mean, some things are not the same. And I mean, Stalin was all about growth and construction and building, and you know, socialism is all about growth and building and construction. And I mean, that's just what these people are preaching. You might be able to make some parallels with the Cultural Revolution and people turning in their relatives or people being held to political correctness standards. But other than that, there's no connection at all. I mean, what these people are promoting is not Marxism in any conceivable way.
Yeah, I've also said that too, you know, because of, I think one thing that I found, though, when you discuss this with right-wing people, you know, just from their very basic understanding of what communism is, you have to kind of hit them with the fact that if these people were communists, they would be working. So, it would be, when you kind of like break it down, like, okay, this city isn't communist. No, if they were communists, they'd be building things. All these people out of work would be put to work, maybe against their will, you know, oh no. But like, I'm saying, like, come on, things would be getting done. Like, nobody would be without a job here, you know? So, I mean, that's kind of caught people off guard. I'm like, oh, you're right about that. So, you know, appealing to that. But joking aside, yeah, I do. That is just a frustration. Obviously, there are so many people who don't have an understanding of it, and I think it's just because they have been indoctrinated, you know. And you have to kind of use humor and catch them off guard and kind of slip your seeds in there, you know. And honestly, I find that people who are right-wing are often more able to have a conversation about economics, about politics, and actually, you know, seed some things when you have a discussion about socialism and communism and you come at it that way. Because, you know, maybe it's just because they're not as emotional as well, because I think the thing about the woke thing is it weaponizes people's emotions about injustice and is used to manipulate them, you know, that they're in their feelings, and people who are in their feelings all the time are really dangerous because they can be moved and manipulated so easily.
It used to be the conservatives you couldn't talk to and liberals you could.
Definitely.
And now,
yeah.
and that it's clear the woke people are the new neocons. It's the same
Yeah.
ideology, basically, which is that the United States and the Western civilization is the bastion of freedom, right? Bush invaded Iraq to spread freedom, and that that there are these bad people that don't support freedom, around the world, or whatever, and it's the same ideology. It's just kind of a new interpretation of it, is what I would argue. And the cancel culture, you'll remember, actually started with the neocons. During the Bush years, they started canceling college professors on Fox News.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the right is not immune to canceling people. So
yeah,
they're
they kind
very,
of invented it. There was just no
Yeah.
social media. They used Fox News to do it. Some professor said this against the war in Iraq, or said America wasn't the greatest country in the world, God forbid, or something like that.
Yeah.
And they would destroy a professor's life, and that would terrify all the other professors that, oh my God, my student's going to, tape record me and I'm going to lose my job. And they kind of invented it. And then social media got going, and we transitioned into the Obama years. And so the Obama administration and the woke people started doing what the right had already been doing for a while. They just started doing it themselves. And that, again, the message is the same. The West is the bastion of freedom, and the countries that oppose the West are all the same as Nazi Germany somehow, right? That's what Bush said about Saddam Hussein, right? He's a Hitler or whatever, and that, it all gets back to everyone the American imperialists are against is Nazi Germany. And the West is the bastion of freedom and democracy, et cetera. And we need people to just wave the flag and support freedom. And if they don't do it, they're bad people. They need to be morally shamed. It's really the same ideology as the neocons. It's just, it's got a different emphasis. It emphasizes LGBT stuff and feminism and stuff. And because of that, the right, and it's still opposed to any form of populism, which is, I mean, the neocons were also opposed to any form of populism as well. So it's just the populist energy is on the right now. I'm curious how long this will last. I'm curious, Biden is so unpopular. I'm wondering if we're going to get some kind of anti-woke neocon government again or something. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. And I'm curious to see how this election turns out, because it's going to be weird, because whatever they're doing isn't working. It's certainly destroying people psychologically, and it's destroying the country. But the country is not excited about a war with Russia. I mean, you saw that, the war in Ukraine, the spending, people are not thrilled about it. Polls show that Biden's wildly unpopular. Trump would win if the election was held today. So, what are they going to do? What is the next card they have up their sleeve? That's my question. So.
I mean, yeah, it remains to be seen. And there's so much we could go off into about that. I feel like there was something else that was triggered in me about the book that I'd read, but I really appreciated going kind of back to the time of the invasion of Iraq, because that, I was a young woman when that happened, and it really did, obviously I protested that war many times, and that was a part of my young activism. So just to kind of be brought back to that and to think about the situation and how it's led us to today is helpful. And just, it's so interesting to me that Bob Avakian came back to the US at that time. And I'm wondering, like, I don't remember, and I know I read it, but why did he leave the country?
Well, that's a good question, right? He was charged with leading this protest against Deng Xiaoping, and then the charges against him were dropped. And then the charges were reinstated, and then he fled the country, and then 10 of his followers agreed to plead guilty in exchange for the charges against him being dropped. But he stayed in Paris. But it was charges stemming from the protest against Deng Xiaoping when Deng Xiaoping visited the United States. And in the book, I go into detail about how that protest
that was wild.
Yeah, I mean, they destroyed and smashed the Chinese embassy on the day that it opened in Washington, D.C. And it I mean, that is a crime, I mean, they destroyed it, and then they were not arrested for that. And then they had another protest, and then 2 RCP members got into the White House grounds and ran at Deng Xiaoping with their little red books in the air. And that we now know, thanks to, the research of some academics who published a very good history of FBI infiltration of the RCP, that the FBI was using a right-wing organization called Western Goals to infiltrate the Revolutionary Communist Party, and that Western goals was run by the John Birch Society, people that were opposed to the U.S. having diplomatic ties with China. And so the informants in the RCP that were tied to this right-wing organization didn't want the USA to have ties with China, so they used the RCP to smash the Chinese embassy on the day it opened. They used the RCP. The U.S. Air Force granted credentials to 2 RCP members to go inside the White House, which you cannot do, by the way. I've reported from D.C. for years. They will not give you credentials, right? I could go to the State Department. I could go to different places. You cannot get on White House grounds. It may have been easier a long time ago, but openly as communists, they were granted credentials to go onto the White House grounds and disrupt a press briefing, by Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. And it was clear they were being used to cause a problem and try to stop U.S.-China relations. What's also interesting is after this book has come out, a number of people have come to me. There's an article that shows in Houston, Texas, when Deng Xiaoping went to Houston, Texas for an event, to speak when he was touring the United States. There was a rally against Deng Xiaoping where the John Birch Society and the RCP were both there. It was the John Birch Society and the RCP. And there were multiple high-ranking members of the RCP. They were actually, Western Goals John Birch Society members that were, kind of manipulating the RCP to do their bidding against China because the RCP had a falling out with China. What's also interesting is that there was a communist party that supported China still and supported Deng Xiaoping. That was called the October League, or the Communist Party Marxist-Leninism. And during these years, and Bob Avakian talks about this in his autobiography, they published a fake issue of their newspaper and distributed it to hurt the group's reputation. That's wild. Now, if there's a group that actually does support China and you're publishing fake issues of their newspaper, if you're trashing the Chinese embassy, if you're disrupting events with the Chinese president when he visits the United States, and then we find out the FBI is all over your organization and helping you to do it, I mean, you're being used at that point. And that's pretty clear. And then the sad thing is this is also the same time as the Iran hostage crisis was happening. Yes. And there were all these right-wing anti-Iran rallies that were happening. And the RCP members would go to those right-wing rallies and light American flags on fire and get the crap beaten out of them by right-wingers. And that they were almost like, in wrestling terms, they were the heels. Right? They were the scary, evil communists to get the crowd pumped up at these Iran rallies. And a lot of RCP members got badly hurt. There was one RCP member who got killed during these years, a guy named Damian Garcia, who was stabbed to death after he put the red. He went to the Alamo and he took the American flag down and put up the red flag. And a couple days later, he was stabbed to death.
Oh my!
Yeah, it's very, very horrendous, and that it looks like the RCP, these right-wing groups had kind of infiltrated them, and were using them to kind of be the caricature of evil, America-hating, foul-mouthed communists to scare the American public that was becoming more right-wing in the lead up to the Reagan Revolution. And also to try and harass Jimmy Carter and intimidate Jimmy Carter as he was establishing diplomatic relations with China. And that seems to be what was going on. And that's very unfortunate. But at the same time, I look at that as almost a tragedy of history because, it's like the RCP, all the pro-China groups were falling apart. They had their falling out with China. They denounced China. They had to find a way to survive. And if you're going to survive as an organization, you have to have some kind of function. Well, being the rodeo clowns of communism, that was the role they could take on and still exist. And it's kind of a tragedy of history. And it's also, I will add, probably why they have lost their minds over Trump and endorsed Biden. Because if so many of their members got beaten up and injured by Reagan supporters and by conservatives, they're never going to understand Trump. They're never going to understand that Trump, despite all his flaws, is giving voice to anti-establishment sentiments. When you have that much trauma, when people in your group have been killed by right-wingers and stuff, you're just going to have it in your head, the right wing is Satan. Anyone who's right-wing is my enemy. And that kind of explains why they have acted the way they did. And it's unfortunate, and it also probably explains why, I mean, the French were against the Reagan sending weapons to Nicaragua, and the French were
Right.
critical of the United States in the 80s. They wanted better relations with the Soviet Union. So aligning with French imperialism, covertly or secretly, I mean, which it's pretty obvious at this point. I make the case pretty strongly in the book. But it makes sense that they would be lulled into thinking, well, the French are the better imperialists. The French aren't so bad. They want better relations with the Soviets. They oppose Reagan, and the Reagan ones beating us up and injuring us. And that's what makes all of this, once people start getting killed and once people start getting hurt, politics takes on a very different character. And that's one thing that many people from around the world have pointed out to me. You can argue on the internet all you want about communism, this kind of communism or that kind of communism. But when there's a body count, when people are dead, it becomes very hard. I argued with an Iranian communist who was protesting. I interviewed the president of Iran last week.
Yes.
UN. And that's
big deal.
Thank you. That same day, though, there was a protest by some Iranian communists who were out in front of the UN, and I argued with them, and it was like talking to a wall because they were thinking about Iran in the 80s when they fled. And Iran's not the same country anymore. A lot has changed in Iran. Iran is now very close to Venezuela and Russia and China, and I know a lot of Iranian communists who have gone home. They're allowed to go home now, and that Iran has been pushed into an anti-imperialist position, and it's very friendly with many communist countries, and things have changed. But in the 80s, yes, Iran did execute a lot of communists. And so these people that were out there protesting, I kind of feel bad. I maybe I should have been nicer to them, but that's their trauma they're speaking to, right? They had relatives and comrades who got executed, and their attitude is going to be, these people killed my friends. That's all, that's all you're going to hear. And, they're out in front of the UN with Zionists, with the Mujahideen Khalq, with Shah supporters saying we hate the Islamic Republic. And it's like, in their mind, my relatives, my friends got killed by this government. It's the same government. I hate them. That's the way they're going to think. And they're not going to be able. And that's why I really wish that, I feel like as much as obviously people being killed and stabbed is not the same thing as internet cancel culture, I really wish that some of these internet debates and some of this internet viciousness would cool it. Because once people get badly hurt, they stop thinking coherently, right? And that I feel like some of these internet arguments I see where two people disagree, but suddenly it becomes go for the kill. It becomes, I'm going to hit you below the belt. I'm going to bring up your family. I'm going to embarrass you. I'm going to talk about private things that don't belong. At that point, that person's going to be your enemy for the rest of your life. You know what I mean? You can't go back from that, right? I can disagree with somebody about this, but when you attack somebody and you viciously harm them, it becomes very hard to repair the relationship. And we should all be thinking about that. Friends disagree with friends, people. There may be somebody that you disagree with now, but you don't have to escalate it to turn into, a blood feud because, then it becomes very hard to repair relationships. Somebody who's your enemy today might be somebody you need something from or you need to have an alliance with down the road. And so it might not be strategic to escalate everything into you're a Nazi, I hate you, way of going. I mean, obviously that's different, but it's important to think about that. Not everything has to turn into a bloodbath, but the internet is rigged to make everything a bloodbath, right? I mean, it is, right? It's designed to make you have a big, ugly fight with everyone over every disagreement. And you have to actively guard against that if you're going to survive psychologically or especially politically.
I think, my perspective on that is just that one should really be very careful about holding on to any anger and not letting that spirit of anger take hold of them, because once you do, it controls you. And a lot of the times I think there is just so much ego caught up in the work we do. Let's say on our little platforms, our humble little platforms, that it becomes our identity in many ways, and it's a false identity. And because of that, people are very easily, like I said, regardless of what the emotion is, you cannot be operating from it. And people that are emotional and operating from that are going to be dangerous to themselves and to others. So as much as possible, we have to, learn to, die to our emotions and kind of try to operate logically and with the best intentions.
No, I remember. I'll just use an example from my own life. Is I remember when I was a college student, when I was active as a communist, I remember, a lot of times back then, and such shows how much the world has changed. But if you're doing activism in the Black community around police brutality and all of that, a lot of times you'd end up going to a church service. And I was a college student,
Yes.
and I'd grown up, and I had to go to church every Sunday with my family, and I had become an atheist as a teenager. And I remember when I was a college student and I was being active and I was going to protest stuff in the Black community, and I would go to a church service, I would be triggered. And I would be angry, and I had memories of childhood and things, and I would be visibly angry and upset by going to church services. And and it took me a while. And then I remember on my college campus, somebody started a progressive, like a leftist response to the Campus Crusade for Christ. It was called SCOPE, which stood for Space for Christian-Oriented Progressive Engagement. And I was like, there was so little like leftist or free-thinking stuff on my campus. I thought, well, I need to go to it. And I had a lot of anxiety before I went to it. And I finally went to SCOPE, and it felt good. And then I felt good. And it was like I had healed from whatever my baggage was enough that even though I was still an atheist, I could go to this Christian space and actually feel good about it. And I felt relieved. And I was like, wow, I've been, I'm at the point where I can attend a religious gathering and actually kind of enjoy the discussion with people. And it was like I'd healed somewhat. And then I eventually, I rediscovered my Christian faith when I was in Iran. And I tell that story in the book. And that, it took me a long time to get back to God because I associated God with God with a lot of things that
conservatism.
Yeah, with a lot of things that I didn't want to be associated with. And I had made a point of separating myself from as a young man and as a teenager. And that when I was actually able to return to God, it felt amazing because I was returning to God on my own terms, right? It wasn't a God that had been imposed on me. It was a God I had always had a connection with, and I'd always felt attached to. And it was a relief in a way. It's like you don't have to be at war anymore. You don't have to be on guard against these things anymore. And that's what I would encourage people to do is that, healing is just something that takes time, right? I mean, if you've been hurt and if things have happened in your life related to anything, it takes time, but you have to be open to it too. Right. And it was very hard for me to go to SCOPE when I was, it was the club on my campus because I had it in my head, oh, if I go, I'm going to get upset again. But when I went, it felt good. And it's like you have to kind of push your own boundaries sometimes, right? That's part of healing is pushing your own boundaries and kind of saying to myself, yes, in the past, these things have been hard for me, but I'm going to challenge myself, right? I'm going to go out of my comfort zone and try something that might have triggered me in the past or might have made it hard for me. I'm going to challenge myself to push my own boundaries a little bit. And that is what I have found, is probably the biggest barrier for people for getting involved in activism is that they did some activism at one point or somebody on the internet was mean to them and they have this anxiety about going to a protest or going to a political event because it reminds them of something that happened. Well, you have to, if you're going to heal, part of healing isn't just letting time pass. It's also challenging yourself. It's also saying, I'm going to push my own boundaries a little bit and see if it works. I'm going to test the waters a little bit. And that's what I would encourage people to do. Is it if you had problems in the political spaces before or whatever, test your boundaries a little bit. Go to an event, go to something and see if it's right for you. Speaking of which, there's going to be an event in your city in December, which I thought
I was wondering if you were going to bring that up.
I could shamelessly plug it here right now because you'll be there and I'll be there. And this is going to be on December 2nd. Dare to Win a World Beyond Imperialism. It's going to be the National Convention at the Center for Political Innovation. It's happening in Portland, Oregon, location to be announced on December 2nd. And it's going to be great. It's going to be really, really great. I know you're going to be there. I'm going to be there. And I hope that we will get a lot of local people to come as well as members of our organization from around the country. It looks like Scott Ritter is coming. It looks like Nick Brana of the People's Party is coming. It looks like there'll be people from the Libertarian Party there. Jyoti Brar of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, who spoke at our conference in March. It looks like she's flying in. It's going to be a great event. Timoshenko just booked his flight. He is so excited. He's in St. Louis, Missouri, but he's just booked his flight. And I'm really excited about it. So I hope people will be there. And I thank you, Terri, for giving me the opportunity to plug it shamelessly here. But there you go.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Well, this we could go on. I did want to say something about the healing process and understanding that when you are traumatized or when you're in pain, it does keep your world very small. That it's generally people go into their shell, and you have to understand that you are blocking yourself from experiencing life, and you cannot let what's happened to you do that. You just can't. It's going to bring you so much more unhappiness.
Terri,
So,
what I really liked about meeting with you in Portland, and I really like here, is that you and I were on different parts of the country, right? And I think the first time we ever met in person was in Portland when I sat down with you and Elizabeth. But we have ridden this storm together. You know what I'm saying? Like we kind of we've gone our own way and we've evolved our political way. When I first encountered you, you were with Radical Women and you were talking about Trotsky a lot, and I was in the Workers' World Party. And we have been through the last, at least decade and a half together, and we've kind of observed all the same events, from the perspective of being someone who's a social media personality, someone who's critical, someone, and we have very similar observations about them. We don't see eye to eye on absolutely everything, but we've ridden through the same storm, and we're looking at the same problem. And we also want there to be a similar solution. We realize that community is the answer and that you can't do this alone, and that the social media stuff, as much as we've both indulged it quite a bit, is pretty toxic.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes you can only learn these things through experience. I mean, and this is new as well. It's a new thing. So how else would we learn? And hopefully through our learning, we will, in some way be able to educate and help others to maybe not go down similar paths, hopefully. But I mean, if you do, this is the thing. And I'm so glad you talked about bringing it back to your faith in God. In the woke world and in the world itself, we'll just talk about what is the world. It's everything outside of you and your relationship with your creator, right? There's no redemption. Change isn't possible. And so that kind of, we need to have that in our lives in order to be able to forgive and to redeem ourselves and to move on. People will, like I said, remain in their shell if they don't understand that redemption and forgiveness is possible. And I think that's something that's really been concerning in this culture. I mean, Christianity has been on the decline the rates are, when we're talking about like the war in Iraq, right? And the invasion that happened that time.
I just want
so many people.
I want to read so many people the story of the prodigal son. I want to open the Bible and read them that story about how the son who went away and was lost and wasted all the money and all of that comes home, and the father celebrates it, and the son who's been good the whole time says, "Hey, how come you're giving him all this stuff? I've been good all the whole time." And the father says that the son, it's better that one is lost and then found, and he makes that point, because the cancel culture people do not understand that at all. In their minds, if someone's lost, they're lost forever. And they do not understand that it is so much better to have someone who is wrong and has done wrong and realizes that they've done wrong and starts to do right. That's way more of a victory than just condemning somebody for doing wrong, which is just what they're seem to be about, and on top of that, I think, I made a post recently where I said, so much about social media is just finding the good people and the bad people. And you made the point, there are no good people.
Yes, right? I did say that. Yeah, there are no good people. I remember that during the, one of the scariest experiences I had and kind of led to my awakening in 2020, I would say, like spiritual, like real spiritual awakening that I've been on for so long. I had this coworker and she was a liberal, like just caught up in so much stuff, just caught up in so much stuff. I could get into it about her, but she was, obviously there were the requirements as workers we had to go through due to the conditions of the pandy and the panda bear that we dealt with, you know, and there was just so much. She was going on about like how her household, which was a, you know, collective household, were doing all these different behaviors. And then she was like going, you know, and complaining about people who weren't taking all these different precautions and not living their lives in the exact same way. And then she just, at the end of her like tirade, she was like, and we're doing this because we're good people. And I just had this like disgusted feeling like go through my whole body. I don't know. And it wasn't like judgment of her, because I was just like, you know, she's a few years younger than me, all of that, like she's, you know, caught up in all this stuff. But I just, that statement, we're good people, I'm a good person, that mentality. And I was like, I would never, you know, be righteous in that way, because I'm not, you know, I've definitely done things in my life that, you know, I look back and I'm like, what the hell, you know?
Me too.
Yeah. That's being a human. And if you don't have that awareness, you're going to really be open. When God eventually humbles you, you will be very humbled. And the more self-righteous you are, the worse it will be.
And you know what the worst part of this is that I think a lot of the people that are on the internet and judgmental, they know deep down what we're saying here. They know that they're flawed. And part of the reason they're attacking people on the internet and pouring judgment, and part of the reason that they're avoiding joining any real community, is they fear they'll be exposed. They feel that, you know, that people will discover that they're not a quote unquote good person, you know, and so they've got to be on the internet condemning people, and they've got to keep their distance from the world because they'll be exposed. And one point that I have always made,
do virtue signaling constantly so everyone knows what a good person they are.
Because deep down they feel like they're not. I mean, you know, and one point that I have always made about the Center for Political Innovation is that if you have talked shit against the Center for Political Innovation, if you said nasty things about me or other members, but you've changed your mind, you're welcome. You're welcome to join. You know what I mean? We don't hold grudges against people. Now, if someone has demonstrated that they are a danger to the group, obviously that's a different story. If somebody is, you know, you can't have people that are going to put the group in danger per se. You know what I'm saying? But, you know, there have been a lot of people who just got the memo that we're whatever, you know, Nazis, I don't know, whatever, you know, whatever they want to call us this week. And without knowing anything, have decided to condemn us or whatever. And I feel like a lot of those people watch the streams and lurk, you know, they're probably watching right now. And they have it in their minds, well, I talked this way, Caleb blocked me, Caleb, you know, or people had a big ugly argument with me about this on Facebook or on Twitter, and so I have to stay away. No, you don't. No, you don't. You're welcome. You know what I mean? We've made mistakes. I've said things I regret. I've done things I regret. There's many, and we're not in this, you know, to try and, you know, we're not building a group of people that we think are superior. You are welcome. And we've had people. There are a number of members of the Center for Political Innovation who have come to me and said, Caleb, I was wrong. You know, this is who I am. They've showed me nasty tweets and screenshots, and they said, can I still join? And I said, yes, of course you can. We're happy to have you. And I've done things I regretted, and so have other people. And that if you're going to have a real community, you have to get beyond this, you know, shallow virtue signaling. Now, you know, I'm not going to get into specifics, but there have been situations where, you know, people would be in danger, and that's different, right? No one's going to be in danger, right? You know, you have to protect a group from anyone who would put you in active danger. But other than that, you know, if people are not, you know, breaking the law or otherwise considered, you know, active danger, they're welcome to come. And that's actually better, because if you do that and you come forward and you say, look, I made a mistake, and, you know, I was led to believe that Caleb or the Center for Political Innovation were like this, and I was actually wrong. That's good, because other people will see you do that, and then they will do the same thing. or they'll question what's being said. So I actually think it's more important that we get people like that, that people who used to be hostile to us and are now friendly are great. Rainer Shea, he's not a member of the Center for Political Innovation, but he's going to speak at our conference in Portland. And he and I are friends now. He said horrible things about us. He called us white settler nationalists and all this kind of thing. And you know what? He saw that war against Russia was the main threat. And he realized that the Rage Against the War Machine rally was really important, even though it was not, quote unquote, politically correct. And he got viciously attacked. And he said, whoa, now all the stuff I've been saying about Caleb, all the stuff I've been saying about these other people, they're all saying it about me now. And maybe it's not true. And he woke up and he had an awakening. And now Rainer Shea is our good friend. You know, he's going to come and speak at our conference. That's a great step forward. And we need more people to do that. Right. And you have to create an atmosphere where, I mean, was it Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? He said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. That's the attitude we've got to have, right? Because, you know, that this culture of, you know, everybody has to hold a grudge over everything. There are some things that matter, and there are some things that maybe they matter a little bit, but they can be overcome. And what matters right now is that our country is about to launch a new world war. Our rights are being taken away. People are dying every day from opioids and committing suicide, and the living standards of this country are dropping, and the roads are falling apart. And that the only way we're going to get out of this mess is if people do something about it. That's what matters. You talked smack about me, or I talked smack about you, or somebody was offended by somebody. That doesn't matter that much. I mean, maybe it matters to some degree or other, but it doesn't matter that much. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's what we need to understand. And as a movement, as an organization, as a society, we need to get that kind of understanding. That's my feeling.
Yes, I think this will be my last point. Since you had talked about the prodigal son, I wanted to talk about in the Beatitudes, Jesus talks about the poor in spirit being blessed. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. What did he say? Oh God, what does he say? He said, but blessed are the poor in spirit for, God, now I feel terrible, but I think that sticks with me, you know, because the righteous, if you've always been righteous, and I think it relates to the story of the prodigal son, because if you've always been righteous, if you've always been right, if you've always been doing the right thing, you don't know how much you need redemption, and you don't know how much you need to be connected. Yeah, theirs is the kingdom of God. Yeah, I mean, that's the kingdom of God, right? If you know that you need, thank you, Patrick. Yeah. If you know that you're poor in spirit, if you have fallen, if you have a fallen state and you've not been righteous, then, and you're aware of it, your spirit has been poor, then you will inherit the kingdom of God. Is that awareness.
Yeah.
To answer Kay's question, it's usually because those Christians are aligning with other forces. It's it's not about the Christianity, it's about the politics that they're associated with.
And it's changed, I would argue, in the last.
I would say so too, and there's so many Christian socialists around the world. I mean, even the Pope, a little bit lefty.
Indeed. Well, if you're watching this on my channel, go and subscribe to Terri Strange. That's the channel. That's Terri's channel. Go and subscribe. She does great chats about all kinds of very interesting topics, spiritual, political, etc. Go and subscribe. And I'll see everybody in Portland December 2nd. And it's been an honor to be on your channel, Terri. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Yes. And thank you for joining me and having me on your channel as well. I'm glad we could do this.
All right.
And get the book.
Sure. Yeah. It's a good book.
Yeah, it's very good. It was a very quick read. It was and full of information. Full of information. Like I said, if you don't know anything about the RCP, this will help you understand them. So, yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Have a good night. And